Joe presents TKO, together with 32 Red.
Welcome to round 15 of TKO on Joe, together with 32 Red. We're a podcast and YouTube show, and we'll be with you every Thursday. Very pleased to say our guest today is a man whose voice you'll recognise very, very well indeed. He's called some of the biggest fights of the last couple of decades on BBC Radio 5 Live, none other than Mike Costello. Pleasure to have you with us. Thanks for coming in.
Great to be here.
What were we listening to this morning? Was it your entrance to the Quigg fight?
Yeah, I love that one. I like to listen back, actually, the radio stuff. You always watch the fights back on TV, but I like to get the radio commentary too, whether it's yourself or even Jim Neely back home radio also.
Yeah.
But we had, when I came out against Quigg in Manchester, you and Big Tony Bellew, it was amazing. I get goosebumps. Maybe it's just me listening to it because it's about me, but yeah, it was brilliant. I sent it in to the boys in the group chat. So,
but there is something about you painting your own pictures while you're listening and revisiting where you were at the time.
I completely agree. And when was that fight? 2016. And
yeah, just over 3 years
still
ago.
Get goosebumps about that now. Yeah, it's great. It's just different. The radio commentary's different. I like listening back.
That was a really interesting instance because that was one of those nights. If you remember, Jim Watt on Sky scored it a draw, and one of the judges as well. And people all around ringside kept turning around and asking me and Tony Bellew how we'd scored it. And we just kept saying wide. And we couldn't understand where else was going. But but at that time, sometimes that's when you do have to hold on to what you believe and your experience and just go with what you feel you are seeing and not be, what I say is be a shepherd, not a sheep. Don't listen to everybody else around there. There might be a time when you get it wrong. There was a similar instance just before Christmas with Tyson Fury. I mean, we had him winning everything for the first 4 and 5 rounds. Then I get a message from my producer saying some of the American journalists have got Wilder in front. Well, we turn to Andy Lee and what are we doing here? Are there chairs round the right way kind of thing? It's, and that's when you, as a commentator, it takes experience. If that had been my first fight ever, I might have thought, I can't get this wrong. And they're all right. Jim Watt and all these guys who've been doing it for years. So you have to hold on to your nerve,
You have to, but also part of your job, presumably, is to gauge the public opinion. And if there are murmurs around ringside, is it part of your job to deliver that information to the audience that are listening?
Absolutely, and that's what's changed over as recently as the last 5 years. This surge of social media interest. I know Twitter's been around for a decade now, but it's only the last 5 and 6 years that there's been this real constant attention during fights, and you've had reporters at ringside who are doing live texts, and then they're doing round by round by round, and so there is this constant need for information as it's actually happening, rather than just a general drift of how the fight's going. So we often do say what others around ringside are saying about fights, and quite often they're very close, and so that's worthwhile.
We were talking last week about how much social media's changed the game, weren't we?
Yeah, and it has massively. Everyone has an opinion, and everyone can now voice their opinion because of social media. Whether that's a good thing or bad thing, I'm not quite sure.
You're not on Twitter, are you, Mike?
No.
There's a fake one going about. I remember
there was
about a year ago,
which I laughed about. Instead, he started digging and swearing at Eddie Hearn, and then it started to get dangerous. So, really calling Eddie Hearn out. And it was funny, actually. It was around the time of Brexit. And he was in negotiations. Eddie was in negotiations with Jesse Vargas to fight Kell Brook. And because of Brexit, the value of sterling weakened against the dollar. And so there was this conversation going on between Eddie Hearn and Bob Arum and Jesse Vargas about how the terms might have to change because of what's happened to the pound against the dollar. And I was getting all this because Jesse Vargas thought he was talking to the BBC boxing correspondent and therefore wants to get it out there. All these negotiations. So, but it was when this guy started to really lean on Eddie Hearn that I had to and apparently it happened 5 times before they finally.
The thing is, you think these guys, you have a clear, when there's a parody account that's funny and it's a clear parody, that's funny. But when someone's actually impersonating another person, it's like, it's weird.
Yeah,
it's weird. Really
it's quite a lot of time on your hands to be doing something like that. Yeah. I think it was Buncey that actually that sort of outed and said, just so you all know, Mike hasn't got a Twitter account.
It was Bunce.
Yeah.
It was Bunce.
Who else had one that I was following?
John Fury.
John Fury.
Yeah,
that's the one.
Yeah, there was another fake one.
I was following him for a while.
Of course, you and Steve do the BBC Radio 5 live boxing podcast every Monday as well.
Yeah.
Steve is obviously the quiet one of the two of you. You've been working with Steve for years and years and years, haven't you, at the BBC?
Yeah.
When does that go back to? Do you remember when you first met him?
Personally, it goes back to when we were kids boxing on the South London circuit. And frankly, we were both failures. And that kind of informs what we do. You know, we worship people like Carl. And I can say this happily in his company, in a way that I'm not sure everybody else or many others in the media could. Because we were failures down at our, grassroots club level. When they walk to the ring, when he's 4 and 5 steps away from our commentary position, I get this feeling in the pit of my stomach because I'm like this Walter Mitty character. I wish I was doing what he was doing, but I wasn't good enough. I wasn't brave enough. So that's where I go back to with Steve, and then we if you like, we kind of rediscovered each other through the media, through boxing. He started out as a down the table reporter with the Daily Telegraph, and I started with the BBC World Service. And in those early days, we had no idea that we'd one day be going to Las Vegas or outdoors at the Titanic at Belfast and all those major nights, mad nights that we dreamt of being part of as kids. And we just gradually worked our way up.
I didn't know you came. I knew Bunce boxed before. I didn't know you boxed yourself as a kid. And maybe that's probably where the passion comes from. Like when you can hear it in your voice when you're listening to the radio commentary. There's definitely passion there, and it's probably because you know the game. Not know it as a spectator, but you've done it.
What I always say, Carl, is I do have an insight because of what I did, but everything I did was over 3 rounds. What I can't get my head around is what you do when it gets to 8, 9 and 10. I've heard Ricky Hatton and many others say that at that point, however much you trust your trainer, whether it's Jamie or whoever, it ultimately comes down to you. And that's where I haven't got a window into that 8, 9, 10, and when you've really got to drag it up from somewhere. In a sense, as an amateur, you can always see the finish line. It's only ever 9 minutes away. It's very different. And I remember many people laughed and dismissed and dissed the fight between Floyd Mayweather and Conor McGregor, but there was a fascinating comment from McGregor at the end of the fight. And he said, he sat down on his stool after the 5th round. This was at the press conference. He's drinking whiskey, but he still had enough time to get serious. And he said, I sat down at the end of the 5th round, and he said, Jesus Christ, there's still 7 rounds to go.
He looked exhausted.
So he was paying a massive compliment to all of these people without really understanding what he was saying at the time, And that the length of those fights and the grueling nature of those fights and where these people are prepared to go, is what makes it so absolutely fascinating for me, both, before and leading up to the fights, after the fights, but mostly on the night of the fight. There is no moment, there is no place like ringside anywhere in sport. I've been lucky enough to cover a lot of sports. I cover track and field athletics, which means I'm front and centre for the Olympics, the number 1 sport in the Olympics, athletics. But apart from Super Saturday at London 2012, there's nothing that can match a big fight night. And as far as we're apart here, Chris, this is this is how far we are away from the ring. There have been times when I've had blood on my notes. That's how close we get to the very best of elite sport.
So on fight night, we always hear about the fighters' preparations. What about your preparation? Because you're putting all of your concentration into, up to 36 minutes of action, plus the intervals as well. Where does your prep start for a big fight week?
The prep actually starts, and maybe this is unwittingly, when the fight's announced. Because you're then starting to weigh up how the fight's going to go. Immediately on air, you're asked who you think is going to win. But it's a very gradual build-up. And for me, with boxing, it's very different to the other sport I work in, athletics. If you've got, say, for example, Mo Farah in a 10,000-metre race, and you've got 25 athletes, and you've just got these, and I mean pages and pages of information. And again, you have to hold on to your nerve in a different way there. Whereas with boxing, there are only 2 men up in the ring. You're never going to get the identity wrong, which is a big factor in athletics. But the danger is there that you make it so boring that all you say is left, right, left, right, left, right. So during the week of a fight, it kind of just, I find you just absorb all the information. You go to the media workout, you go to the press conference, you go to the weigh-in. And at those events, different fighters have different approaches to what the media workout means and how important it is. But you start to get a sense of how big the fight is and how it's playing out around the general public. You'll be there talking to, there might be American journalists over, or you're over in Vegas, so you're getting the flavour of how the Americans see the fight or whatever. You talk to trainers, even talk to fans, and you just, during the week, you know that the whole sort of, the lines around the fight, the rumours around the fight all start to circulate, and that informs, the commentary of the fight, rather than a list of how many fights you've had, when you were born, where you're from, and all of that. Because by the time you've covered somebody who's at world championship level, you pretty much know most of that. We don't have that many world champions that have to keep long catalogues of stuff. I'm very aware that listeners don't want to hear just lists and lists of statistics all the time. And then the danger is when, for radio, on television, you can see it if the commentators are talking over each other, or they've moved on to an anecdote and suddenly someone's on his back. In a sense, that doesn't matter so much because you can see it anyway. But on the radio, if I suddenly drift into Carl started at Midland ABC at the age of 7, and bosh, suddenly he gets hit with a left hook, you have to judge when you can introduce an anecdote rather than just go left, right, left hook, uppercut all night long, and that becomes tedious. You have to judge when you can just drop in an anecdote or just a line from the build-up. I saw his trainer during the week and he said this, and that, maybe when the referee breaks them up, or so you use that 3 or 4 seconds to just drop something in.
Yeah.
Do you think it's important to build like a relationship with the fighters as well?
Yes. Yeah, I do. And over time, sometimes it comes down to personality. You have different relationship with different fighters, and that I think can impact what happens afterwards, Carl. We were talking off air about just before we started about Amir Khan and this great contradiction that people are laughing about after the fight against Crawford, when he talks about, I had 5 minutes, I didn't know I had 5 minutes, and all this kind of stuff. And I've had a bit of stick online. I'm not on Twitter, but of course I have to follow it and monitor it. And I've had a bit of stick for not picking him up on that. And I won't do that because he's been battered around the ring. He's not had a game of tennis and a game of football. And that's a really difficult judgment to make as a journalist, somebody who's a trained journalist. I should be picking that up. But you've seen the images of it. It was filmed as well as recorded for audio. It's all over the place, and there's no way I'm going to grill him at that stage. In fact, you'd have a solid argument to say you shouldn't have done the interview, Mike, and I'm not sure I'd have a persuasive answer for that. I had a similar stick with Tony Bellew's last fight against Usyk, and I interviewed him. We had the rights, if you get the radio rights, you can wander up onto the ring apron. You've done it with Thomas Kane and all the rest, and I kept on at Tony, and he kept just saying he's brilliant, he's world class, and he was saying the same stuff, and people said, Mike, you should have let him go. He needed.
The thing is, I don't
help.
think that's your call, and I think because I was talking about that fight, like I feel like the way Tony was knocked out and hurt badly, I think that I know TV and radio and stuff pay a lot of money to get access to these fighters, but I think in a situation like that, it's important to be assessed properly by a doctor first. I feel like anyway, and I know maybe some big wigs in the TV companies or radios may not agree with that, but I remember just thinking someone should step in here. I don't think it's on to you, but I think someone should step in, and Tony Bellew should be in the back room somewhere.
See, that was part of my thinking, Carl, was that he'd been assessed by a doctor.
Okay.
And then had been led over to our side of the ring. So that was one of the reasons I continued with it. Later on, I realised that he'd done like 40 minutes at a press conference and was his typically voluble, articulate self. So that made me feel a bit better, but it doesn't change the fact that I had to make a judgment right there and then. The difficulty, Carl, there is, and you'll know this, Chris, is that had I not interviewed him at ringside, and all the other journalists, the newspapers, the social media websites, and the IFL TVs had all got his reaction, all got his story, then I'm failing in my job. So this is the real dilemma and the balance you have to find. The post-fight interview is a really important part of the whole story. And if you don't get that, then unless the fighter has been taken away, for medical attention, then you've not actually done the whole job. And it is actually also, going back to what you said, part of what you pay for. You pay for that access as well.
So on a big fight night, say the Warrington fight, for example, when you've come out, the decision's not gone your way, and you've had a hard night in the ring as well. How difficult is it to go through the rigmarole of interview after interview? How many would you say you have to do?
I don't know. I can't remember what I done after the Warrington fight. Did I speak to you guys?
No.
But
I tell you why. The problem there for you, Carl, is that, clearly we go to the winner. So by the time he's done however many interviews on it, well, you can't wait forever.
Yeah. I remember doing a few. Done with my BT backstage afterwards. Didn't go to a press conference because I was hurt, like properly hurt, and really, really tired. And I wanted to get back to the hotel. And actually, on the taxi ride back to the hotel, I asked, could I just go to the hospital here just to be safe?
Yeah.
But it's I don't know. I felt like I remember doing the interview with BT straight after the fight, and Frank kind of called me over into the interview with Warrington. And I was beaten, so I was kind of like, let the man talk. He's won the fight, but Frank got me involved as well, and that's probably the only reason why I done an interview in the ring.
Yeah.
Or I'd have been offside somewhere in the change room, drying my eyes.
Crikey. Big kind of change in the last 8 or 9 years in the landscape of boxing. Certainly the stadium fight was brought back by the first Froch-Groves fight that led to Wembley in the second.
Yeah.
Certainly a memorable night for you, that must have been, right?
That was really, really special. I remember sitting virtually on the centre circle. And again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier on about this hero worshipping. I was thinking of looking around the stadium. The first thing I thought was what it must have been like for those athletes at London 2012. I know that wasn't the stadium that was used for London 2012, but I just looked around at the vast stands and how far away they seemed from, the eye of the storm, if you like, and what it must have been like to compete at the games like that. And then thinking, these guys, Carl and George, are going to walk from the dressing room and they're going to see something and hear something like they've never, ever heard before. And you just get that wow factor as soon as you walk in, and all the pitch is covered, and it was a really special night. And the punch that Froch found is one of the all-time great punches.
Unbelievable shot, and I can remember the way you summed up the fight just in the moments after, and everyone else is in just complete shock, and as a fan you go into disarray. But you, in that moment, the difference between the first Froch-Groves fight and the second is that you at least have some indication that you're maybe building towards the finish or something's happening. Whereas with that, it was left hook, right hand, and quite a nip and tuck fight is suddenly over.
Yeah.
And you've got 80,000 people losing their minds. But you have to absolutely focus because you're the eyes and the ears of the listeners.
Yeah.
You can't deviate from task for a second.
Yeah, and goes back to what I was saying about had I been in the middle of an anecdote there, and lost the moment, one of the great moments, in recent British boxing history. Now, again, through experience, because they were moving into a corner, then I would never have gone into an anecdote at that stage. But that was just truly, truly remarkable. It was one of those where somebody said to me after Usain Bolt won the 100 metres at the Olympics in 2008, and I've been lucky enough to cover every single one of his gold medal winning races and commentate on them. And I went for dinner with the great javelin thrower Steve Backley and an old coach of the British team called George Gandy in Beijing afterwards. And he said to me, this old fella George said to me, when Bolt does something like that, because he virtually danced across the line, you just don't win Olympic finals like that. He said, how do you stop yourself saying me on air, on the BBC? Because that's actually what you've got to do. Yeah. You've got to get as close to swearing as you can, because everybody in that crowd went, me, did you see that kind of thing? So you've got to try and articulate exactly what most people in pubs or in the crowd are saying.
I was thinking that actually, how do you stop yourself from, like, in a moment like Froch-Groves where it is a nip and tuck fight and then suddenly it's over, how do you stop yourself from just saying, holy shit, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
that's it.
I look forward to when you're next at the commentary. Well, the great
Yeah.
thing about it is often actually Buncey will give you the pitch, because I can remember that it's almost etched in my mind that Froch right hand, because Buncey went like that,
Yes.
but you are just saying, and the right hand's laid him out, and you're going through the description so that you don't lose that. But with Buncey and the crowd, you've got your atmos and you've got the gravity of the occasion, which allows you to kind of focus on what you've got to do, I suppose.
Yeah.
That Olympic 100 metre final in Beijing was something else, because Powell was the favourite really going into that on form, and he'd only just had the world record taken from him, but he'd been...
And Bolt had broken the world record, but there were doubts about him on the big occasion.
Of course.
Because he hadn't won anything at that
Well,
stage.
he's silver, the world champs in the 200 the year before against Tyson Gay. And cool, you're lucky, man.
Yeah, and that's it is. I mean, I often describe the 100 metres as the heavyweight championship of athletics, because that's another event that can be won in the head, all the way through the build-up. And I remember a big race in Beijing, a world championship final between Justin Gatlin and Bolt. Basically, it was billed as a match between good and evil, the man who'd failed drug tests against it, the saviour of the sport. And Gatlin had won 20 successive races on the way in, but I said he's won 20 races that didn't have Usain Bolt in them, and Bolt won the final. And I find that fascinating about boxing and about athletics, the build-up. How much do you genuinely believe that you are, I don't think you get to where you are unless you've got really, really strong temperament. But Carl Frampton said to me a few years back, he fought this American called Yusuf Mack, and when Mack came over to a press conference in Nottingham, he started calling Carl a plastic Joe Calzaghe. So I said to Carl afterwards, what do you make of all that nonsense? And he said, Mike, he can say what he likes here, but when he puts his head on the pillow at night and those little demons creep up, those demons of doubt, then does he really believe? And that's what fascinates me about races like the 100 metres, where you can absolutely lose it in your first stride. And look at the fight against Warrington. It can change on the opening round. The tempo of the whole event, whether it's a fight or a race of that nature, when you're on your own, it's different in a team scenario.
I mean, one of the big differences between Usain Bolt and Asafa Powell was nerves on the start line. You could visibly see Powell relaxed in every round, the semi-final, and then the final, he looked a different guy. What about yourself? Because you've got to, especially in something like the 100 metres, you've got to sum something up from start to finish in 9 and a bit seconds. Do you get nervous? So when do the nerves start?
Usually about mid-afternoon. But here's where boxing, even as a kid, even down at a lowly level, helps, because I remember getting the same feeling kind of mid-afternoon in school, and then sort of losing concentration, whatever we were doing in class, because I was only thinking about what was going to happen that evening, and building the whole event in my head in this tiny little schoolboy level. But I learned over time. I mean, I had about 60 bouts in the end, and so I learned how to deal with nerves, as you go through the grades. I didn't go that high, but you do, you get to a stage where you box young lads that have got a bit of a reputation, and you have to deal with that for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and that's very similar to what dealing with a 100 metre final at the Olympic Games. That was the first one I'd done for BBC 5 Live, so I really felt on trial, the one in 2008.
God, that was your first athletics for 5 Live, was it?
For 5 Live, yeah. So really on trial there, and those nerves appear in mid-afternoon, but I've now got to that stage where I almost... I not enjoy, it's the wrong word, but once those nerves come, I know that I'll be sharp and ready.
It's the big event of the whole Olympics as well.
And it is
the 100 metres. You have to get it right.
And it's all I've worked for in the same way that you trained in your way and I've trained in my way, and all the way through the years to get these gigs, to be front and centre. And that's something you have to remember as well, and not let it really overwhelm you and overburden you, in that there are so many people who want to do what you're doing. How many people are commentating on that 100 metres in the stadium? It's a really privileged position to be in, and so you have to make sure that you don't let it drift by in a sea of nerves. You must hold on to how special it is, and just I remember walking 4 years later to the stadium at London 2012, and again I had these nerves, but I looked up and I thought, wow, There's all these people have paid 100, 200 quid for a ticket, and and I'm going in tonight. And again, it was Bolt who won, but it is that's a challenge like no, it's a very different challenge to boxing. Because of, you said 9.5 seconds. I remember an old English teacher of mine said the average sentence that we speak lasts 3 seconds, like maybe the one I've just said. And so you've got 3 seconds, three sentences across that race. If you mentioned all 8 athletes, it'd be gone. They'd be past the line. If you blink, that's the difference between the first and the 8th man home. That's in time. So those are the margins you're talking about. Even at the longer distances, Mo Farah won 2 races over 25 laps and 12.5 laps, and his total winning distance was 0.8 of a second. So these are the margins that you got, But it's in boxing, it's you lean back from a shot, and you make someone miss, you catch with a counter. If that first shot catches you, the counter doesn't land. Tiny margins at the highest level.
Also, I guess controlling your voice is an important part of it, because you need to give yourself somewhere to go in the event that something unusual happens, or suddenly you get that Frochgroves moment, or for the final straight of a Mo Farah race. Do you have to protect your voice in the build-up to fight week? Does it take a lot out of the vocal cords, do you think?
Yeah, boxing is very different in that you are there right in the bear pit, whereas in athletics you could be as far as 50 or 60 meters away from the action. So it's a very different strain on the voice, because all of that crowd noise is descending on the ring, and you're right there, and it's the action is so relentless, 3 minutes at a time, 3 minutes at a time, without any comments at all, or any kind of breakthrough from the summariser or whoever, Bunsey or whoever you're working with in terms of an ex-boxer. So it's 3 minutes relentlessly, of describing where they are in the ring, and going back to all those other things I was saying about not being too repetitive. So it's very different. Whereas for a long distance race, you might let a couple of laps go by and just talk about Mo Farah's background or whatever, knowing that the only thing that could happen there that could trip you up would be him tripping up. Yeah. But it's there's much more pressure on those 3 minutes in a ring than there is anywhere apart from that 100-meter final.
For a boxing match, it's got to be so difficult to describe a boring fight. Like boxing I think it's the best sport in the world when it's a quality fight and 2 guys are well matched. But if it's a stinker, and it's not even nice to watch on TV as a radio commentator, it must be so difficult to
it is.
describe.
And again, that's so you can then use more of that kind of anecdotal stuff and the background material. But the two, people would say to you, where do you think you were best? What commentaries are you most proud of? And it's not necessarily those monster nights or even the Olympic finals. 2 really, really difficult commentaries I did were Tyson Fury against Vladimir Klitschko, right, and David Haye against Nikolai Valuev. Now, as spectacles, they were boring as hell. But the key was we had to keep. The one in Nuremberg, the David Haye fight, didn't have much of a crowd behind it, but the one in Dusseldorf had a massive crowd. They were still cheering madly for Klitschko. So you do have to still spell out that although we're finding this tedious, it is the crowd here are loving it. So you have to go with them. But also, what we were spelling out on both occasions is this is going to be a great night. It's not a great fight, but it is going to be. It looks like it's going to be a great night. So, they're really difficult.
Do you remember how you scored that fight, Fury and Klitschko?
By 3 to Fury.
Because I had it pretty close as well. But people talking about the Klitschko, Joshua, and Fury, Klitschko. It's because time has elapsed. People think of that fight as a complete one-sided beatdown.
Very close.
And it wasn't. It was a close fight.
Yeah.
You're watching TKO, together with 32 Red.
As right now, though, here's Alex Payne with something else from Joe.
Thank you very much indeed. It's just a moment or two for us to duck in and tell you about the House of Rugby. We're having a lot of fun. What are we trying to do with the show? Why should people be watching and listening? We are
Tracy trying to mix everything up.
This is going into another show so that people come and watch us.
Oh.
Hello, everyone. Say hello to nice people.
Right. Well, we should basically watch House of Rugby because it's unbelievable humour. We don't talk about any rugby, and we give you the inside track from people who are still actually involved in rugby, not old 60-year-olds who don't know anything.
Good. You can download us via YouTube. You can as you can tell, we're a very professional outfit. You can watch us via YouTube and download us via iTunes. I hope you'll join us at some point. It's a lot of fun, really.
Thanks, Alex. Welcome back to TKO Round 15 with Mike Costello, BBC 5 Live boxing and athletics commentator. Let's pick straight back up off those fights. I guess the point being, as you say, there's a difference between a boring fight in of itself, but actually the context and the narrative that surrounds that fight. And with both of those fights, the commonality was a changing of the heavyweight guard. So start with maybe Hay and Value, because that chronologically was before.
Yeah, and that was one of those fights as well. I say that fights fall into three categories. There are the fights that only boxing fans are interested in. There are the fights that boxing fans and general sports fans are interested in. And there are the fights that, for whatever reason, they envelop everybody. Everybody's interested in them. And this was one of those on that third category, simply because of the size of Nikolai Valuev. And when they stood together at press conferences and the weigh-in and whatever, there was, you could almost hear the mum saying, "Oh, don't let him go in with that big fella. He'll never do it." And so that had a massive build-up. And there was such a conflict as well in terms of what ex-boxers and pundits and writers had a viewpoint as to who was going to win. It was almost split down the middle that Hayes just too small for this fella. I mean, I had a viewpoint at the time. I couldn't see how he would lay a glove on him, and that's what happened. I mean, I got that one right. I've got many wrong in the past, but that was one where sometimes you see a fight really clearly. I don't know if you find that, Carl, but you see a fight really clearly, and you can't understand why nobody else is seeing it. And in other times, you just
totally
get
wrong,
so wrong, and that's the fascination of this sport. You just never know.
You took over from John Rawlin when he moved to TV.
Yeah.
So you worked on. Did you work on Athens, the Olympics there?
Yeah, but I was working there for the BBC World Service. So I was working there as a kind of a general reporter. I did cover virtually all of the athletics in Athens, but I was working there, and 4 years earlier in Sydney, likewise as a general reporter.
Right. Okay.
So I've covered 7 Olympic Games now. So
you joined the BBC at, I read, 16. Is that right?
Yeah.
Quite very young.
It was a very different landscape then. You'd never get into the BBC now at 16. I mean, for example, I got a job in the accounts department, and that's now outsourced. It's not done by the BBC anymore, so there wouldn't have been that route in, and then just pestered the sports room for anything, and I got a job as a runner on a Saturday afternoon eventually, without pay, but just literally running results from the old teleprinters over to a studio. So that was my way in, without the necessary qualifications to go straight in as a broadcaster.
And not to give away your age, but this is sort of mid to late 70s we're talking about. So
76, yeah.
You're in a golden age of the fight game at this point.
Yeah.
The kind of later years of Muhammad Ali. Just talk to me about what you were watching in terms of sport and boxing, but also how were you watching it? Because it wasn't like it is these days. Were you still able to watch the big fights in the cinemas? Were they still being screened in cinemas at that point?
Yeah, but I was too young, because inevitably, you'd have to go to school the next day. But my dad used to, I live in and have lived in South London all my life, or in and around there. My dad used to go to the Lewisham Odeon to watch the big fights. The Ali fights were on in the cinemas.
I'd love that.
All around the country.
Love to watch a fight in the cinema now.
That'd be great, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, in fact, all the way through to even my professional lifetime, I watched Frank Bruno against Mike Tyson, the first fight at the London Palladium. And I tell you, it was just one of the best boxing experiences of my life. They had a huge screen which took up the whole stage, and when the lights went down, it was the next best thing to being there. And
you've got an atmosphere, haven't you?
It was fabulous. They had to stare down, and I remember Mike Tyson looked away. After the referee's instructions, Mike Tyson looked away, and all the crowd started saying 1-0, 1-0, and then 15 seconds.
I was going to say it was over pretty quick, wasn't it?
Bruno was on the deck.
Yeah. So the 70s and 80s you grew up in, that was when the first emergence in the UK of the kind of war of the promoters. There was like this sort of cartel that was operating. Sort of Mickey Duff and Jarvis Astaire and Harry Levine had contracts with the BBC. And then it was kind of Frank Warren that disrupted the status quo, I guess, that in the mid 80s, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that created a big change, and that competition was great for British boxing, and it meant, from what I understand from boxers at the time, it meant they started to earn a lot more money than they had previously done, because there was now a serious challenger to the cartel that you talk about, as successful as they were. But Frank Warren was, at that stage, was a real... It was a new broom sweeping through the sport, and everybody knew about it, And it was at a time post Muhammad Ali, so the sport needed something, not just here, but globally. It needed something, because you can imagine the impact he'd made on the sport. And I'm often asked, if there's anything you could have covered, what would it be? And it would have been the rumble in the jungle in Zaire in 1974. Wow, to have covered anything of Muhammad Ali, and that's I actually went to covered his funeral nearly 3 years ago now, and as morbid as it sounds, it was a massive thrill, just to be able to revisit and see how special he was, and the turnout at the memorial service, and it was really, really special. My dad used to wake me up at 5, 6 in the morning to tell me the results when he got back from Lewisham. My mum used to, mum and dad are both from Galway, and my mum used to say, leave him alone. Because I had school the next morning, but my dad would creep in and tell me the results. And there was this really kind of weird, almost mystical coincidence that I got a call from the 5 Live production team at 5:20 on this Saturday morning, almost to the minute of the time my dad used to come in and tell me the results, and they rang me to tell me that Ali had died, and we want you on air from 6 o'clock. And that was a whole day's broadcasting about the impact that Ali had made. So that going back to what you said, that was the boxing world I came into. If you were at all interested in sport, then you couldn't avoid the luster of Muhammad Ali, whether you went into boxing or not. He was a monster figure at that time. God knows what he would have been like now in social media, 24/7.
I remember Ed Robinson tweeting about that. He said, imagine sort of like an HBO 24/7, like when they do the build-up. So imagine that with Muhammad Ali. That would just be something else, wouldn't it? Yeah. But yeah, he set the precedent for the kind of talking and the braggadocio in the way that we see with Tyson Fury and some of the other guys now. The precedent between the promoters warring. Frank Warren has he's warred with Barry Hearn and now with Eddie. But I guess as a benefit, as Mike said, you must have seen the benefits when you're renegotiating contracts, knowing you can play off guys against another to secure a better deal.
I think competition is healthy in anything. Definitely boxing, and it's strange that you've got and it's probably because of social media, but you've got, whereas before, when you're talking about Mickey Duff and Jarvis Astaire, they wouldn't necessarily have been fans of the promoters then, but Eddie Hearn and Frank Warren have their own fan clubs now, and guys that, I'm Team Matchroom, I wouldn't watch a Warren show and vice versa, and it's strange. But as a boxer, personally for me, when I left my previous team, it was Warren and Hearn, and I went with Warren in the end, but it was just
nip and tuck, right?
It was nip and tuck, and it was a wee bit of negotiation and stuff there, and it worked to my benefit, I felt. But competition in anything, I think, is very healthy.
The problem is, though, Mike, is that we've almost gone the other way now, where we have so much competition, so many different networks, and this kind of refusal to budge from certain promoters and certain networks, that we're at a stage, certainly now, that it's to the sport's detriment in some aspects, and it's stopping some big fights from being made. Is that frustrating as someone who's been through those golden eras to see the situation that we're in at the moment?
It is, and I have this kind of push me, pull you feel about it all, because again, going back to my background, I understand or have an inkling of what they do, and therefore any fighter earning that kind of money for me is a reason to celebrate, because there are plenty of people making money in the game, and it's not always the fellows who take it on the chin. And so it may well be that Wilder and Fury and Joshua are going off on their different pathways at the moment, but they're all earning crazy amounts of money. And look, I know deep down the fans ultimately want those to meet. I think they will. At least 2 of those 3 will meet at some stage in the next year. But in the meantime, they're earning phenomenal amounts of money. And I just think in my time in covering boxing, but also in being around boxers as well, and just again because of my background, I've been around a lot of low-grade boxers, and there aren't a lot of happy endings.
No.
I've said it before, there aren't a lot of happy endings. So if I hear about a bloke earning $3, $4, $5, $6 and more $1 million for a fight, in Fury's case against Tom Schwartz, given what he's done against Wilder, against Klitschko, I'm not digging that. I'm desperately frustrated, and I'm unhappy that he's not fighting Wilder in the rematch. But what, has he paid his dues or what?
Yeah.
And like I say, that the boxer's earning that kind of money. What's the? I wouldn't know. I haven't done the research. What's the percentage? It's tiny.
Yeah, it's got to be. We spoke about this before. It's got to be less than one. It's probably less than 1% of boxers worldwide that can actually make a living after boxing.
Well, look, just go down. We've got 1,000 professional boxers in this country. How many of those wouldn't have to work as well?
Yeah.
They call themselves professional boxers. They're actually semi-professional boxers, aren't they? So it's not all about the glory, is it?
And you mentioned paying your dues. I kind of feel like, obviously, someone in your position, you just signed this deal, which is, I guess, a good deal for you with Top Rank financially, but you would have gone so many years in the early days without being paid, and you never get paid for any training sessions. So that pay essentially is backdating all of the hard work you've done over 2.5 decades.
It's a bit of a gamble, because at the start you're kind of, you get a few quid, but that's what you're getting, a few quid, and you're kind of living off from purse to purse until you start to win meaningful titles. It's not even really about meaningful titles a lot of the time as well. It's about fan base, and it's about tickets you sell. Because there's a lot of quality fighters who are world champions that probably aren't that well off because they're not selling tickets, and there isn't the demand on TV and radio for them. I've been lucky enough that I've got a big fan base and I've done pretty well, especially recently. And this new deal with Top Rank as well. But there's years at the start where you're kind of going from fight purse to fight purse, and that's what you're living off, and you're like, I need another fight here because I'm running out of money. And that's the way it is for all boxers. And it can be even worse than that, where they box as kind of a side earning. They've got another job, and boxing's something else that's coming in. Especially the journeyman. We spoke to one a few weeks ago on the show, and it's completely different than the guys at the very top end of the sport.
Yeah, it is. So just over 2 decades of commentating on some of the biggest fights. Which etch in your memory as your favourite nights to work on, the favourite fights? Talk to me about what sticks with you.
There are many great memories. Those 2 that I mentioned are special for the 2 reasons as to how difficult they were, but they were great nights in British boxing history. The one at Wembley, George Groves and Carl Froch, the rematch. The first fight in Manchester of Froch and Groves was a monster. The one that really sticks out, I suppose, in terms of the commentary demand, would have been Froch against Kessler, the rematch.
The punches that were thrown.
Yeah, that was staggering.
Yeah. Well,
but there are other ones.
Really doubled his punch output from the first to the second, I think, in that fight. Yeah. So it was just all out, wasn't it?
Remarkable. The pair of them. Yeah, just one of those instances where you talk about, styles make fights, and my God, it made a classic. But the first one in Denmark had been a cracker as well. And
Froch had problems, hadn't he, flying out? Was that during the ash cloud? Am I right?
It was, yeah. That? Yeah, and he'd been told that the fight was off, and so the Sunday before the fight on the Saturday, he had a family barbecue because he was convinced it was off, and then suddenly a couple of days later, it was on. But there are surprise ones as well. I mean, you'll accuse me of saying this because he's here, but of all the big nights he's had, it's maybe the one that sticks out. You fought Chris Avalos at what's now the Odyssey. The noise. I was doing it with George Groves. He was the co-commentator, and I just nudged him and said, when you were introduced, take the headphones off and just get this real, rather than as the engineers are sending it to you. And the noise was absolutely ear-splitting and it was just a fantastic performance when you consider the rounder picture. Just that was an amazing night. But they always are when there's almost like I describe some of those noises in Belfast. It's like a Latin heat. It's a different kind of noise. It's
well, Katie Taylor
really,
at the Olympics.
Really Latin.
Yeah.
See, I didn't see any of her fights because I was always in the athletic stadium.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to be there. At that one.
It was different.
insane,
It was different. The only one that got close was probably Anthony Joshua's final, really. But actually, I would say consistently the noise at Katie's, and that was in London as well.
Hey, and we talk about the margins. I mean, you look at Joshua's fights. I mean, all four of them were like wafer thin, and just all the way through.
A completely different story. You're talking about margins again. Like that's if Joshua. A lot of people thought he lost the first fight.
Savon. I'll be honest, I thought he did.
It's a different story.
Yeah.
And I think he won the fight against Camarelli in the final. Very close, but I had to give it to Joshua.
It was countback, wasn't it? It was 18 all.
It's like, and if something goes the other way, then the story is completely different.
Yeah.
But as a narrative, I mean, that for it to go to countback, and I can remember the silence around the arena, and there was a guy called Dan OSullivan, who's a local ring announcer who'd known AJ for a few years.
Yeah.
It was his job. They put the paper slip in his box. He sort of pulls the slide down so he knows the result, and that's it. And I was watching to see if he gave anything away, and he was absolutely poker face. And he went the winner on countback. And I just remember when he announced Joshua's name, the whole stadium exploded. And that triggered a new era completely commercially, and the landscape changed again. But I guess for you, as you say, you have to savour those moments, and you have to understand that you're witnessing a piece of history, because although that history lives on, that moment goes within a few minutes, and you lose that. So you got to hold on to it, haven't you?
Yeah, and sometimes you are aware, as you walk to an arena, you're aware in a very different way to the boxers themselves that this is a night that might resonate. And for London 2012, I was very aware that these are races and events, and you get the same with fights that are going to be pulled out of the BBC's archives for years, and like we're doing now with stuff in the 60s and the 70s, and it's going to have the name Costello next to it, and that makes me really proud.
Yeah, absolutely. I know one of the ones, and I hate to mention it, but you missed one of the biggest ones, Joshua Klitschko at Wembley, and just an epic night. Obviously, you were unwell at the time. Difficult to know that you did miss something like that, I guess.
Yeah, it really was, and not just because I was ill at the time. It was one of those again that you've worked so hard and so long to be in position for nights like that. And people try and console you and say there'll be another one, but they don't come around very often. Those nights don't come in bunches. They really don't.
No, they don't. Did you go to that?
No, I was at a wedding. I always seem to be at weddings for big fights. And I always end up watching, and the brides are never that happy when, half the wedding party clear out to watch a big fight. But I was at a wedding watching that, and I remember just watching it going, what a fight that was. What a fight that was.
The crescendo of the noise in round 11, I think, because it was the perfect narrative for the crowd, wasn't it, really, in terms of both been down, and then 11 was the, Klitschko's gone down, got up, gone down, got up. And
he answered so many questions that fight as well, Joshua, because it was he was just bowling everyone over, and he was hurt himself badly in the fight against Klitschko. So the question was always hanging over him until that fight. What happens when he gets hit?
You're not going to get hit with a much better right hand than that, are you, really?
No.
Answered a lot of questions that night. Who's your favourite fighter ever?
It's Ali.
Yeah.
In terms of what he did in the ring, it's Sugar Ray Leonard, but the whole picture, what he did for the sport and the impact he made and what he did as a heavyweight. If you watch his performance against Cleveland Williams in '66, you'd be proud to throw those shots as a featherweight.
And the first Liston fight, it's almost like he glides over the canvas.
Yeah, and you imagine the mind game before that fight and what Liston's done to Patterson and Ingemar Johansson, and it's really. I think I was lucky to have been a teenager. For all I wish I could have covered the career of Ali. I still think I was lucky to have been a teenager, an impressionable teenager around that time. But I was much more aware and much more able to understand what Sugar Ray Leonard did. because I was more into boxing at that time. And as a commentator, I've been lucky enough to be around Floyd Mayweather and the big Floyd Mayweather nights, and they're something special as well in a very different way. You know, he brings a very different dynamic to boxing, but he's fascinating to be around. You see the big hotels in Vegas change over the course of the week when Mayweather's in town. It's like Tommy Tourist all through Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then suddenly the whole nature of the hotel changes for Thursday and Friday, and it's a very different atmosphere.
Says a lot about how much he brought financially to the sport. They pushed his jail sentence back so that he could box. So it brought in something like $1 billion to the Las Vegas economy just on that weekend alone. Yeah, almost unheard of.
Deferred his sentence by 6 months. Yeah.
He's another one that don't feel like he'll get his dues for another maybe 15, 20 years once people have just forgotten the stuff outside of the ring and his personality, maybe his skill.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about dues, you look at the money he's earned. So there was a market for him, and that's the market he reached out to. And I think, there comes a time when you all grow up as businessmen as well as boxers. And look, he was promoted, and I spoke to Bob Arum just about this in the recent week when Amir Khan fought Terence Crawford. Crawford's now promoted by Bob Arum, and he was talking about how Mayweather saw what Bob Arum, didn't see in 2005, 2006. And this is 40 years into Arum's promotional career. And he said that Mayweather was looking to market himself to this black urban audience, which Bob Arum just didn't understand. The black people he knew were a very different generation, very different type. And so he couldn't understand what Mayweather was aiming at. And so Mayweather bought himself out of the contract, paid $750,000 to get free of Bob Arum. And you calculate what he's earned now. You're edging towards $1 billion. And this is a lad who was held up in front of him by his dad, was held up as a shield against his uncle who was about to shoot his dad as a kid. That's the background he came from, and yet that's how sharp a businessman he is. So he grew as a man as well as a fighter. I think as a boxer, he was born into the wrong era. The likes of Willie Pep, who were marvelled at because of their defensive genius. He belongs maybe in that kind of era, but his personality sold a fight like no one of the current generation. And I keep hearing this refrain that Mayweather only ever fought boxers when they were past their best. Yeah. Look what Cotto went on to become world middleweight champion. Look what Alvarez has done since. Yeah. Manny Pacquiao beat Timothy Bradley. Juan Manuel Marquez knocked out Manny Pacquiao. Look at the form since Mayweather beat him.
I think the Cotto one was the best one for me.
Staggering.
Because it was so easy. Not the Canelo win.
Yeah, the Cotto was actually quite a tough fight. Yeah, the Canelo win, he made look it was just easy.
And look at what Canelo's doing right now. You know what I mean?
And one judge scored it a draw.
Yeah, CJ Ross. Yeah. Scary, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mike, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. Before we go, though,
Likewise.
We have a section that we do called the 32-second challenge. So it's word association. I'm going to read you out a list of words, and then you're just going to say the first thing that comes into your head. So this is the 32-second challenge with Mike Costello. Okay, Mike, first words, the microphone.
Commentary.
Lynn Amateur Boxing Club.
Glory days.
John Rawlin.
Predecessor.
Fight nights.
The best.
Froch Kessler 2.
Unforgettable.
Steve Bunce.
There forever.
Boxing or athletics?
Boxing.
Nerves.
Every night.
Fight you wish you'd commentated on?
Ali versus Foreman.
Oh, great.
Rumble in the Jungle.
Super Saturday.
The best night of commentary ever.
Awesome. The one round of boxing that you would take to a desert island?
Corrales against Castillo.
Nice round. 10. Unbelievable round. That's all we've got. I'll tell you what, one more. Carl Frampton.
The champ.
The champ.
Former.
What a pleasure, Mike. It's been one of my favourites.
That was good.
Always
really enjoyable. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, mate.
Mike, thanks you so
Chris.
much. Yeah, cheers. Okay, well, that's been round 15 of TKO with Mike Costello done and dusted. Remember to check out some of our other episodes. David Hay, Chris Eubank Sr., Joshua Boazzi, David Price, Jamie Carragher, and many, many more. And we will see you again in 7 days' time. Thanks for watching.
You've been watching TKO on Joe, together with 32 Red.